Our next presenter is Sophia, whose mentor is Dr. Lori Cook-Heffron. And the title of the presentation is Exploring Silence and Stigma Around Menstruation. So we're going to let Sophia share their screen. If there are any troubles, I'm happy to help.
All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much everybody for being here. Like Dr. McCracken mentioned, today I'm going to be sharing with you the research that I have been working on for the last year, which is exploring silence and stigma around menstruation. I'm having some trouble changing my slide here. So the first question that I really want to address is why study menstruation? It's no secret that this is a really stigmatized topic. We understand that this is something that generally people are not supposed to talk about. But I've learned over the last few years in having conversations with other people who experience menstruation that the stigma is really persistent still, and it's something that people are still experiencing on a daily basis. I also still have heard a lot of misinformation spread by college students throughout my experience at St. Edward's. And this came from both people who experience menstruation and people who do not. And that really stuck out to me because one would think that by the time one is of college age, you would probably be able to understand a biological process like menstruation a little bit better. And the last thing that inspired me for this project is really seeing an increased level of advocacy around period poverty. For those of you who don't know what period poverty is, it's kind of this state that many people who experience menstruation find themselves in, which is where they are unable to afford products that are needed during menstruation, like pads and tampons. These products can be really expensive, they add up quickly, and in addition, they're taxed in a way that many other personal hygiene products are not. And so in exploring kind of all of these questions and learning all of these things, I was really led to explore how people experience menstrual stigma and when exactly does it start. I had a lot of big visions when starting this project, and I realized that I really needed to get to the basics in order to understand where these stigmas were starting and when they were taking hold in order to understand why they are still so persistent. So I first started with my literature review, which was of course guided by my research question, and I found several themes in this process. But the first thing that I wanted to note is that research on menstrual stigma mostly appears in sociological and feminist journals. And most literature in general on menstruation appears in those types of journals. They do appear in literature or in journals of biology and science, but those are mostly focused on the biological process and don't really do a lot of explaining of how to explain menstruation to a person who's experiencing it for the first time. So some of the big things that came out in the literature were first the role of the mother as a teacher and a guide. And so this was present through several studies over time where people who expressed that their mother played a really big role in helping them understand what was happening to their body. And then other people also expressed that their mother's kind of rejection of them or not responding the way that the person who is experiencing menstruation for the first time wanted them to react really impacted them negatively and has lasted throughout their lifetime. So that's the first thing. Secondly was this, I noticed that there is persistent literature on social stigma around menstruation. So we know that this is a well-documented topic and that a lot of people experience it, and it dates back very far. And lastly, there's this link between body perception and menstruation. So we find that if a young person has negative views of their own body in whatever form that may take, they're also very likely to have a negative view of their menstruation. And so it's really connecting that link between body perception and bodily processes, and how maybe having a better biological understanding will help people overcome that. So the methods for my research, I decided to do an exploratory study through mostly a convenience sample. And so what this means is I designed a Qualtrics survey, which I then sent out to my personal and professional networks with the hopes that then they would share that with their personal and professional networks. And the reason I decided to do this strategy is I felt that because menstruation is such a stigmatized topic that I really needed to open up a space for people. And so maybe receiving a link for this kind of study from a friend or a colleague would make somebody feel a bit more comfortable in participating. I promoted the survey through email and social media, and then I had also peers of mine who shared it on their own social medias as well. In order to participate, people needed to be 18 or older and have experienced menstruation at some point of their lives. So in order for them to provide feedback on their experiences, they would have had to have that experience to begin with. And then I was really intentional about the way that I designed the survey. All of the questions were open-ended but one, and I made sure that every question, including the demographics questions, were fill-in boxes. And this was so that people could respond in whatever way they felt most comfortable, because this can be an uncomfortable topic to talk about. So I asked participants to share their first experiences with menstruation, and then I asked them if they had experienced menstrual stigma on a scale, and they were able to indicate where on that scale they had experienced it, if at all. And then I also asked them when they had first experienced menstrual stigma. So if somebody had indicated on the scale that they never experienced menstrual stigma, they most likely left this question blank. And then at the end of the survey, there was a space for participants to indicate any other thoughts that they had on the topic. I was able to get 108 responses, which is roughly around what the goal was. The survey was sent out at the time of, with everything with the pandemic happening. So I'm thankful to have been able to get this many responses. And you'll see here that these are the demographics that I asked people to report. None of these questions were mandatory, so anyone that selected to respond to them could. So for the age range, that was between 18 and 54, but the average definitely skewed younger. This is likely because I was using my own network to reach out to people. As far as race and ethnicity, you can see that most racial groups are allocated here, but definitely skews towards two groups specifically. And then as far as gender identity, I opted to include gender identity as a category rather than leaving it off entirely, because I wanted to recognize that not everybody who experiences menstruation is going to identify themselves as a female or a woman. And you can see here that three people indicated that they identify as non-binary, and one person identified as gender fluid. I thought it was important to kind of model this behavior, just because in terms of normalizing the conversation, we need to acknowledge that not everybody who experiences menstruation is going to identify as biologically female. So next I want to go through really the 4 biggest themes that I found from my research, and these are gathered through all of the questions that I asked and illustrated through quotes. So the first theme is really just this feeling of embarrassment, and so feel free to read this quote here and I'll kind of explain what this general feeling is. So most people, when they indicated their first experience with menstruation, used the word embarrassment or embarrassing in some sense. The literature usually refers to this feeling as shame, but I decided to talk about embarrassment because that's what the participants identified most often. And so they either felt embarrassment themselves because they didn't quite understand what was happening to them, or they felt embarrassment because they had been caught or discovered in some way, usually by a parent or a peer, who then made them feel really uncomfortable. The next, and one that kind of ties into the previous one, is the sense of secrecy and a fear of being discovered. So I read many responses of people who described hiding tampons up their sleeves before they go to the bathroom, or hiding pads in their pockets, or taking a little bag with them to the bathroom because they had this feeling that people could not know that they were menstruating in that moment. And this started very young. People who also reported experiencing menstruation around 4th or 5th grade really experienced this because they felt that they were kind of early bloomers and that no one else in their class really understood what was going on. The next topic, and one of the most important ones, I would argue, is the role of sex education in all of this. Several people, when describing their first experiences with menstruation or stigma, talked about having some form of sex education somewhere between 5th and 8th grade, where the boys and the girls were separated into 2 separate rooms, and the girls were talked to about what they would be experiencing during puberty and their changing body, and the men were having the same conversations. Though, of course, in the room that the boys were in, menstruation was not a topic that it was covered, because that's not something that they would be experiencing during that time. And so women reported kind of feeling like this isn't something that they could share with people because they had been separated. So it was kind of that subliminal message that this is supposed to be kept secret and it's only between us. And then lastly, there's this persistent lack of awareness. And so this came out mostly in that additional question that I included, where people could write any other comments that they had on the subject. And a lot of people wrote about how they've seen that throughout their lives, people who don't experience menstruation still have a high degree of ignorance about the subject, and how this negatively impacts their relationships, particularly when you're looking at romantic partnerships and intimate relationships. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this observation is something that really inspired me to do this research as well, and it was affirmed by the participants of the study. So I've gathered some implications here, and there are really three main ones that I see. And these are all areas where research could absolutely be expanded. So the first is that all children need to be taught about menstruation at a young age, and this education needs to continue. Having boys and girls separated when in middle school or late elementary school really ingrains that feeling of shame and secrecy around menstruation early on. If we can educate all children about menstruation and about all changes that are happening to them around that age, the idea is that likely empathy will increase and students will not be making fun of each other, not be perpetuating stigma, and some of those kind of nastier feelings won't develop so early on. Secondly, there are lasting consequences of negative early experiences. And this was something that was also affirmed in the literature review, where people reported that if a parent or a person in a sense of authority responded really negatively to the child experiencing menstruation for the first time, that negative feeling towards menstruation persists through young adulthood and throughout their lifetime. Luckily, there were a few participants who indicated that they had had more positive experiences, and these tended to be on the younger side of the age range of people who participated, and so this may indicate that things are starting to shift, but still the overwhelming majority was that people had had negative experiences early on. And then lastly, and one of the most profound impacts of all of this, is that stigma and shame around menstruation are predictors for worse health outcomes. Because we are teaching people who experience menstruation that they should not be talking about it, all of that will leak into even avoiding having conversations with their doctor about how they are experiencing menstruation. Part of the problem of this not being a biological or scientific conversation is that people are not learning what is normal during menstruation. It's not something where it's anything goes. It looks different for everybody, but there are certain symptoms and experiences that can be indicative of worse health issues that go undiagnosed for so long because people are not taught to recognize those symptoms. So it's really important that young people have scientifically accurate and reliable information to help them navigate this time. And as far as my next steps and the next main portion of this study is that I'm going to be, I wrote a grant proposal to create a website to provide space for people to safely share their experiences with menstruation. And so it'll be a platform where people can interact with each other and share their stories and offer support. And it'll also serve as a host for resources from various community organizations and nonprofits. My goals for the study, for the website, will be to decrease shame and increase access to information and services. And hopefully that these two in combination will really open up a space for dialogue. And then lastly, really stressing the importance of providing people with medically accurate information starting at an early age. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Always, please let's send the questions through the chat, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lori Cook-Heffron to say a few words about Sophia and the research we just learned about.
Thank you. Great job, Sophia. I've learned so much from walking alongside you during this project. This topic captivates me. Can people hear me? Really captivates me as a social worker, as a person who has such a close connection to what you're talking about, as a mom of a 12-year-old. So very selfishly, I've been grateful to have learned so much from you throughout this project. And really, you created the space also just for me to think about and talk about such a stigmatized issue. So what I want to say is that I think this thesis project also reflects the way you've really approached all your time at St. Ed's, that is reflected in how you, your leadership with It's on Us and how you approach your field internship, which is that you really have so intentionally brought your heart and your mind into what you've done in a way that I think really embodies the spirit of a social worker. It embodies the spirit of a scholar activist. And I've been impressed with the way you constantly or continuously blend classroom learning with experiential learning, or you blend that, you pair rigorous academic exploration with a really deep engagement in and commitment to community problem solving initiatives. It's that combination of theory and research with practice and action, and that you really so beautifully embody. So congratulations. We are very proud of this work that you do and the work that we know you'll continue to do as you go out and represent social work and St. Edward's. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Our first question has come in. Did any of your research go into the stigma around menstruation PMS in the workplace or classroom setting for adults?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that's something that Dr. Heffron and I had talked about quite a bit. Unfortunately, I didn't explore it specifically for this project just because I really wanted to get at when the stigma started. However, for my senior seminar project for political science, which is my other major, I am writing about menstrual leave policies and designing an additional survey for that. So I couldn't see who asked that question, but if they're interested at all in talking about it, I'm happy to share.
Excellent. While we wait for more to come in, I have a question. I have two questions, actually. The first is, I was a 4-H'er. It's a large youth organization similar to FFA. I remember vividly when a group of us 4-H'ers got together and she brought in feminine hygiene products from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And we had to open them and explore them and talk about how they were going to be used. Did any of that show up in your research, kind of these communal, non-mom educational events? Because I also sat in on the video when the boys left the room and it was not helpful. I'd already had my 4-H stuff and I was like, this isn't helping me. That doesn't tell me what to do with that thing.
Yeah, so I actually didn't really come across any community programs like that, but there were several studies of kind of young women's empowerment groups where they had these conversations and where the adult was really just playing the role of a facilitator, and these young women were kind of expressing how this shared experience really united them in a way that kind of gave them this power against that stigma. And so I think that really emphasizes that, maybe while we are not having those conversations with both men and women, they are still happening in young women's groups. And that's really kind of creating this strength against the stigma in some way. But I think those kinds of programs are great. And I definitely wish that I'd had those experiences in school when I was younger. I thankfully have had a very affirming family. But I know that that's not the case for many people, so.
Another question for you. Did your respondents talk much about the stigmas or education as related to cultural and/or religious heritages?
Yeah, so I didn't get too many responses about that. I did have one or two who did talk about growing up in more conservative households, and it was less about religion and more just about kind of this traditional gender role. But that's really the only something similar to that I found, where it was something that you definitely hid from dad. You didn't talk to dad about this at all. Dad was not to know that anyone was experiencing this in the house.
And since I've got you and we have 2 minutes, so I just got an alert last week that the new CARES Act that was passed as part of the coronavirus relief packages includes for the first time that you can use your health savings accounts and FSAs to pay for feminine hygiene products. This is new. It just rolled out. Do you know who was responsible for that or how it got put into the legislation? I wasn't even sure if you knew it happened. I didn't know until I got an announcement from Human Resources.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually news to me. I think that's fantastic. Yeah, one of the things, there's so many fascinating things to study about this topic in general. And if anybody has heard about the pink tax, it's essentially this idea that products that are designed for women are essentially taxed at a much higher rate, almost as if they were luxury goods, when in fact these are necessary products. And so, yeah, that's really great. I think it's also kind of indicative of, or it seems a little bit to me kind of like a Band-Aid solution, but it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Oh, we got another excellent one. Do you think the stigma around periods is tied to the fact that menstruation has to do with sexual reproductive organs? Do you think they are over-sexualized at all? I remember in middle school, we weren't allowed to take our pads out of our bag in front of people as if they were something rated R or inappropriate.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I definitely do think that that's part of it. And I was even reluctant to talk about sex ed in this presentation, just because I don't think we should limit this to being a conversation that happens in sex ed, because I think it inherently sexualizes it. And it kind of brings up this sort of problematic trend of sexualizing young women in particular. So I think that's something that we definitely need to watch out for. I think if I had it my way, this would be something that was talked about in like a health class or just a general biology class where people are learning about human anatomy and reproduction. But I also think we need to be really careful about the way we talk about it. One of the things in my research that I found was like, if we tend to veer too much towards the like natural movement of these things, and you start to talk about how the sun, moon, and stars sort of impact the way that your menstruation flows, you really start to lose the biological essence of it, and people become detached. And so those conversations can't happen because people think that that is something that's beyond them. And so I think we have to be careful about balancing the biology of it without making it sexual.
Great. Thank you so much. A round of applause for Sophia and the excellent research we all learned about.